Imagine being so desperate for rain that your identity begins to crack like the earth beneath your feet. I remember when he appeared, Elijah, a man whose voice could slam the heavens shut for 3 long years. He called down fire, outran chariots, and was eventually taken alive in a blazing whirlwind. We Hebrews always cared about bloodlines, tracking every father just to know who we were. But 1 Kings chapter 17 introduces him with zero royal lineage, just a rugged man from a tiny, unknown place in Gilead called Tishbe. He walked into our dying world and changed everything. Have you ever felt that lost, waiting for a savior who comes from nowhere? I used to stand near the palace gates, watching the corruption spill out. Ahab and Jezebel lived in golden luxury, while the rest of us starved, forced to watch foreign altars replace the holy places of our youth. The temptation to just give in, to bow to Baal so my family could eat, was a constant, lonely ache. Into this terrifying darkness stepped Elijah. A wild man from the harsh frontier, he did not belong in those polished marble halls. He brought the raw, untamed power of the Almighty right to the center of our spiritual bankruptcy. No guards announced him, no diplomats cleared his path. He simply struck like lightning from a clear sky. It gave me a terrifying sliver of hope, seeing God use a forgotten man to challenge the idols that were destroying our souls. My heart stopped when the whispers spread through our ruined streets. Elijah had looked the deadliest king in our history in the eye and sealed our fate, just as 1 Kings chapter 17 records. He declared that not a single drop of rain would touch the earth until he said so. It was a total curse, and I was paralyzed with fear. Would my children die for Ahab's sins? The moment he spoke, the prophet vanished. The king sent furious soldiers tearing through our homes, but the Almighty had already hidden him away. God commanded Elijah to flee east to a quiet stream, promising wild ravens would feed him. While I was left trapped in a decaying city, God was keeping his messenger safe. Can you imagine the absolute isolation of that rocky gorge? I often thought about him out there, while my own throat burned with thirst. Tucked away near the Jordan, Elijah sat entirely dependent on a miracle. Twice a day, the sky darkened with black ravens. These were filthy, scavenging birds, the kind that pick at the dead animals littering our fields. Yet the Lord forced those thieves to become servants, dropping fresh bread and meat into his hands every morning and evening. For months, he drank from a clear brook, while the rest of us watched our wells turn to mud. But even his sanctuary could not escape the judgment. Eventually, the brutal heat choked the life out of his stream. The water faded to a trickle, and then nothing but dry, cracking stones remained. When I heard where God sent him next, 1 Kings chapter 17 says it was Zarephath. I almost lost my faith entirely. That was enemy territory in Sidon. It was Jezebel's homeland, the absolute center of the wicked idol worship tearing my community apart. Why send our only hope into the pit of the enemy? And worse, he had to rely on a starving widow. I knew the pain of widows here. They were the most helpless souls among us. Elijah found her near the city gates, dressed in rags, collecting dry sticks for one last fire. The exhaustion on her face mirrored the crushing weight I felt every day. When he asked for water and bread, the panic in her eyes proved she was already preparing to die. I was standing at the absolute edge of my life, preparing what I knew would be our very last meal. Put yourself in my shoes for a second. My husband was dead, the land was scorched to dust, and I was utterly alone. I stared into my wooden bin. Just a pathetic dusting of flour left. My jar held only a few drops of oil clinging to the clay. I told this strange Israelite prophet the terrifying truth. I was gathering a few dry sticks to bake one final piece of bread for me and my little boy. After that, we would simply wait for starvation to claim us. But then Elijah looked at me with wild, steady eyes and told me not to fear. He asked me to feed him first. He promised his God, a God I didn't even know, would keep my flour and oil flowing until the drought broke. He was asking a starving widow to hand over her last bite of food to a total stranger. The temptation to just turn away, to guard my tiny scrap of survival, was overwhelming. Why trust the God of Israel when my own gods had abandoned me? Yet something in his voice pierced my crippling fear. I went inside, hands shaking, and baked that cake for him first. Then the impossible became my reality. The next morning my flour bin wasn't empty. My oil jar was heavy again. Week after week, the food simply did not run out. I could close my eyes without the crushing weight of tomorrow's hunger. My boy's ribs stopped showing. We finally had peace, and I found myself slowly shedding my old life, learning to lean on this mysterious, providing God. Just as I felt safe, my entire world shattered. My son fell ill. You and I both know that sickening drop in your chest when someone you love is fading. I bathed his forehead, but his breathing grew shallow until the unthinkable happened. He stopped breathing entirely. My beautiful boy was dead. The silence in that room was louder than a scream, and the grief felt like suffocation. I had given up my old gods, hosted this prophet, and this was my reward. The pressure in my soul exploded into raw rage. I brought my lifeless child to Elijah, screaming through my tears. I demanded to know if he had come to drag my past sins into the light. Had this holy man's presence highlighted my unworthiness and killed the only family I had left? I expected him to defend himself or leave me in my bitter isolation. I was drowning in guilt, convinced my past as an outsider had doomed my child. But Elijah didn't argue. He didn't offer empty comfort. He simply looked at me, his eyes reflecting my profound sorrow, and said, "Give me your son." He asked me to trust him one more time, to surrender the most precious thing I possessed. My arms trembled as I released my cold boy to his chest. I watched through blurred vision as he carried my entire world up the narrow stairs. I collapsed on the floor, utterly alone in the crushing silence below. Upstairs, Elijah laid my son softly on his own bed. This fierce man, who could command the weather itself, stripped away his armor and fell heavily to his knees. Through the wooden floorboards, I could hear him pleading with God. It wasn't a polished chant. It was raw, jagged agony. He was wrestling with the same terrifying questions tearing me apart. We have all screamed into the void like that, haven't we? Why would God bring tragedy on a widow who risked everything? Why reward my fragile faith with a coffin? Hearing his broken voice, my crushing loneliness eased just a fraction. I wasn't alone in this. Then Elijah did something entirely unimaginable. He stretched his living body completely over the freezing frame of my boy. He was physically fighting death for us. 3 times he threw himself over my son, screaming into the heavens. He begged the Lord to let the child's soul return, asking for a staggering miracle. We were completely off the map of what was possible. Death was the ultimate thief, and it never gave anything back. But in that room above my head, the Creator listened to a desperate prophet. In a heartbeat, the unthinkable happened. The soul of my boy rushed back into his body. The pale gray of his cheeks suddenly flushed with warm color, his lungs pulling in a greedy gasp of air. Death itself had stepped aside. I was still huddled on the floor downstairs, paralyzed by fear, when I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. I looked up, terrified of what I might see, bracing for finality. There was Elijah, his face glowing with an exhausted, fierce joy. He walked toward me, holding my living, breathing child, and spoke the words that still echo in my soul. "See, your son lives." I grabbed my son, burying my face in his neck, feeling the hot, steady pulse of his blood. All my old fears, All the pressure to cling to my dead traditions just dissolved in that embrace. You and I both know there are moments that draw a hard line through your life, splitting it into a before and an after. This was mine. I looked up at Elijah through a blur of joyful tears. My voice was shaking, but my spirit had never been more certain. I told him, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." In my tiny, obscure house, the very first resurrection in human history had just taken place. I wasn't just a poor, lonely widow anymore. I was a living witness to a God who holds the keys to life and death. 3.5 years. That is how long we choked on the dust of our own ruined country. The green valleys of my childhood were gone, replaced by dead livestock and starving neighbors begging in the streets. Even Ahab was reduced to digging through dry riverbeds, desperate to find grass for his horses. We felt entirely abandoned by heaven. But then, as 1 Kings chapter 18 tells us, God finally broke the silence. He ordered Elijah to stop hiding and show himself. The terrifying man from Tishbe, who had vanished like smoke, was coming back. He was marching straight into the jaws of death to tear down the false gods Jezebel chained around our necks. The battle for our souls was starting. Have you ever watched your entire world turn to dust? For over 3 years, I woke up every morning to a sky like burning bronze. We were starving, losing our identity under Queen Jezebel's dark shadow. While the prophet Elijah hid, King Ahab grew desperate. Our royal stables were practically empty, the animals dying from immense thirst. The king himself began searching the wasteland for a single blade of grass, splitting the dead kingdom with Obadiah, his trusted official. But what Ahab did not know was that Obadiah lived a terrifying double life. While Jezebel slaughtered anyone who spoke the name of our God, Obadiah risked everything. We found out later that he had hidden 100 true prophets in dark caves, keeping them alive with stolen bread and water. If Jezebel had caught Obadiah, his death would have been brutal. I can only imagine his terror walking that barren landscape, constantly looking over his shoulder. Suddenly, a lone figure appeared through the heat waves. The utter shock must have dropped him to his knees. Obadiah fell to the dirt, whispering, "Is that you, my lord Elijah?" The most hunted man in Israel stood right before him. Soon after, King Ahab finally came face to face with the prophet. I still remember the thick tension. The king's fury erupted instantly. Ahab looked at the man who had brought our kingdom to its knees and snarled, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" The king blamed Elijah for every dry well and dead animal, treating him like a living plague. But the prophet stood his ground. Elijah's voice carried an authority that made my heart pound. He declared, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, because you abandoned the Lord for idols." He made it perfectly clear that our starvation was the heavy price of our betrayal. Then he issued a terrifying command. He demanded Ahab gather all of Israel at Mount Carmel, along with the hundreds of false prophets who ate well at Jezebel's table while we starved. I walked with the massive, weary crowd toward the mountain, feeling utterly alone and afraid. It was the ultimate showdown. One lonely prophet of the Lord stood before us, completely outnumbered by nearly 900 well-fed agents of Baal. The true identity of our broken nation hung by a thread. Standing on that mountain, the tension was suffocating. Elijah stepped forward, his words piercing my soul. He looked right at us and shouted, "How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him." A deep shame washed over me. The massive crowd remained completely silent. We had been trying to survive by remembering God while bowing to Baal in public to appease the queen. Elijah was stripping away our cowardly masks. He laid out the challenge perfectly: 2 bulls, 2 altars. No hidden sparks, no human fire. They would call on their idols and he would call on the Lord. Whichever God answered by dropping fire from the sky, that was the true God. My chest tightened with fear and hope as we waited for heaven to answer. Have you ever felt your very soul slipping away? That was me in the anxious crowd on Mount Carmel. This test left zero room for tricks. Either the God of our ancestors would answer, or he was dead. The 450 prophets of Baal went first. They smelled of incense and privilege, fat from Jezebel's table. I had bowed to their God just to survive, terrified of losing my identity. They took the best bull, built their altar, and chanted from morning until noon. "O Baal, hear us," they screamed. But the sky remained a hollow vault. The meat just sat there baking in the heat. As the hours bled away and their frantic dancing turned to raw desperation, the silence became deafening. Elijah stood alone, watching them, and a cutting smile began to form on his face. By noon, the silence was agonizing. Elijah's voice boomed over the mountain with thick sarcasm. "Shout louder," he mocked. "Maybe your God is deep in thought or taking a nap." He was exposing the lie I had lived for years. If Baal was the lord of the storm, why was he deaf? The mockery drove them insane. They shrieked, drawing long blades, slashing at their flesh until dark blood ran down their arms and soaked the earth. I watched it pool in the dust, feeling sick. Is this what I surrendered my soul to? After a day of grotesque failure, it was Elijah's turn. He didn't rush into a flashy performance. Instead, he looked at us with eyes that pierced my shame. "Come near to me," he said quietly, walking toward the ruined altar of the true God. I took a hesitant step forward, heart pounding. You know the fear of returning to a faith you've broken. Elijah wasn't just stacking random rocks. He was picking up the shattered pieces of our history. He gathered exactly 12 stones, one for every tribe of Jacob. Watching him place them, a profound ache washed over me. He was reminding us of who we really were before the terror stripped away our true identity. He dug a wide trench around the base, which seemed bizarre. Then he arranged the wood and laid the slaughtered bull on top. I expected him to strike a spark, but instead, he gave a command that defied logic. "Fill 4 heavy jars with water," he ordered, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "Pour it on the burnt sacrifice and on the wood." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. I stood there baffled. If he wanted to prove God could send fire, why drench the only dry wood? It felt like he was sabotaging the miracle. He didn't just want a sprinkle. He demanded a flood. The men hoisted the massive jars and poured water over the meat. Before they could set them down, Elijah pointed again. "Do it a second time," he commanded. And then do it a third time. I watched in disbelief as 12 jars of water cascaded over the altar. Every piece of wood was completely waterlogged. The water rushed down the stones and filled the deep trench he had dug, creating a muddy moat around the sacrifice. From where I stood, starting a fire in that sodden mess wasn't just difficult, it was physically impossible. Elijah deliberately stripped away any chance to rationalize what was coming. There could be no hidden sparks or clever tricks. The standing water eliminated all earthly explanations. He forced a scenario where only the supernatural could answer. The tension was so thick I could barely breathe. The entire nation stood frozen in silence. Elijah stepped forward. There was no frantic dancing, no screaming, just a heavy stillness. He raised his hands and spoke with the calm intimacy of a man who actually knew the Creator. "Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed, his voice carrying clearly. "Let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant. Hear me, so this people may know you are turning their hearts back to you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek. He wasn't praying for glory, he was fighting for our souls. Before the echo of his prayer faded, the sky ripped open. It wasn't a spark or a spreading flame. It was a pillar of blinding fire falling straight from the heavens. The shockwave of heat hit my face like a physical blow, throwing me to my knees. It struck the altar with a deafening roar. In a second, the fire didn't just burn the meat, it entirely annihilated it. It devoured the waterlogged wood. It incinerated the 12 solid stones into ash. It scorched the very dust of the earth, and that trench full of water. It was instantly vaporized into a hissing cloud of steam. My crushing loneliness shattered in the intense light. The Lord was God, and my soul was finally awake. The moment the fire fell, the heat was unimaginable. It consumed the sacrifice, the stones, and even licked up the water. The blinding flash broke something inside me. I dropped my face in the dirt, weeping. And suddenly our entire broken nation screamed as one voice, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" All my fear vanished. We had lived in the shadows for so long, but the truth was undeniable now. You and I both know that true healing requires removing the infection. Elijah knew he could not let these men walk away to spread their poison again. His command rang out, telling us to seize the prophets of Baal and let no one escape. This was not human revenge. As we dragged them down to the brook, it felt like a heavy, dark curse was finally being ripped away from our land. Have you ever felt the crushing pressure of standing entirely alone against the world? You and I know the heavy cost of carrying the truth. For years, I watched these false prophets drag my nation into spiritual darkness. They feasted at Queen Jezebel's table, laughing while they hunted down my brothers and sisters. They stripped us of our sacred identity. But at the brook Kishon, their twisted empire finally crumbled. I watched the people who had been paralyzed by confusion suddenly awaken. Every single one of those 450 prophets of Baal fell by the hands of the very families they had deceived. It was a terrifying, righteous cleansing in the dust. With the liars removed and God's power undeniable, the 3.5-year drought was finally ready to break. I turned away from the lifeless valley, my spirit completely drained. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading into a deep, hollow ache in my bones. I looked at King Ahab, a man still shivering from the raw power he had just witnessed. I told him to go up, eat and drink, because my ears were already ringing with the roar of a massive storm. The sky above us was a mocking, cloudless blue, but I could feel the rain coming in my soul. While the king scurried up the mountain to comfort his shattered nerves, I had far heavier work to do. I climbed higher, sinking to the hard ground of Mount Carmel. I buried my face tight between my knees in absolute, desperate surrender. This was no casual whisper to heaven. It was an agonizing, physical struggle for the very survival of my people. I knelt in the dirt, stripped of my strength, utterly dependent on God to finish what He started. I sent my servant to the ridge to look toward the sea, while I stayed buried in the dust, fighting off the shadows of doubt. 6 times my servant walked that path. 6 times he returned with the exact same crushing news. Nothing, you know that quiet dread, right? The terror that you have risked everything for a silent heaven, but I refused to let go of the promise. On the 7th trip, the breakthrough arrived. A cloud the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea. I ordered Ahab to run for his chariot before the floodwaters trapped him. That insignificant speck over the water exploded into a terrifying, unnatural fury. The long drought ended in a blinding display of divine power. I stood on the muddy slopes of Carmel as the sky turned a violent, bruised black. The heavy rain, the very rain my words had locked away for 3.5 years, finally shattered the drought. I watched King Ahab scramble into his royal chariot, desperate to beat the storm back to his palace in Jezreel. Then, Something unearthly tore through my veins. The hand of the Almighty seized me, burning like lightning in my blood. I hitched up my heavy, soaked tunic and started to run. This was not human strength. I felt no fatigue, no weight, only the sheer, raw power of the Creator propelling me forward. My bare feet pounded the flooded earth, and I actually overtook Ahab's galloping war horses. I beat the king to his own gates. Picture this for a moment. You and I know what it means to be utterly exhausted. But I was outrunning royal stallions in a torrential downpour, my lungs burning with divine breath. I needed Ahab to see that the God who drops fire from the heavens is the same God who empowers a frail, flesh and blood man to defy nature itself. When Ahab finally dragged himself into his palace, completely drenched and trembling, he ran straight to Queen Jezebel. I can only imagine the terror in his voice as he recounted the fire, the downpour, and the bloody end of her 450 false prophets down at the Kishon brook. But instead of falling to her knees in repentance, Jezebel's heart turned to pure, frozen iron. Her reaction was immediate, and it was deadly. This was a woman who had built an empire of blood and shadow, erecting altars to dead idols while hunting down the faithful until we were practically extinct. In a single afternoon, I had shattered her entire religious hierarchy, so she sent a messenger to find me in the storm-soaked streets. The courier delivered a vow forged in hatred, swearing by her dark gods that by this exact hour tomorrow, my corpse would be rotting beside her executed priests. This was not the empty screaming of a defeated queen. It was a cold, calculated promise of murder from a woman who held the armies of Israel in her palm. We had already spent years hiding in dark caves just to survive her purges, and now her entire gaze was locked entirely onto me. I had just witnessed the absolute triumph of the living God. Yet when those words reached my ears, something inside me completely fractured. A cold, suffocating terror wrapped around my throat. The man who had mocked the prophets of Baal and called down a pillar of fire was suddenly paralyzingly afraid of one ruthless woman. I broke. I ran for my life, fleeing like a hunted criminal into the unforgiving darkness. I left my calling, my people, and my purpose behind, pushing south until I crossed into the foreign dust of Beersheba in the kingdom of Judah. I just needed to escape her reach, to vanish into the borders where her assassins could not freely hunt me. The pressure of carrying Israel on my shoulders simply crushed me. I left my only companion behind in the city, desperate to be swallowed by the silent, empty wasteland. I walked a full day into the scorching wilderness until my legs gave out completely. I collapsed under the miserable, spindly shade of a solitary broom tree. The utter isolation washed over me like a tide of grief. I had crashed from the highest peak of holy victory to a sickening pit of worthlessness. I looked up at the burning sky and prayed for it all to end. I begged the Almighty to just take my life, weeping that I was no better than my failed ancestors. I was so broken, so stripped of my identity, that I closed my eyes in the dry dirt, genuinely hoping my lungs would stop moving and I would never have to wake up again. But the Creator does not abandon his fractured servants to die in the dust. While I lay shivering in a deep, exhausted sleep, I felt a sudden, gentle touch on my shoulder. I woke with a start to find an angel standing over me in the desolate heat, telling me to get up and eat. I blinked through my confusion and saw a miracle lying right beside my head, a warm cake of bread, fresh off glowing coals, and a clay jar brimming with clear, cold water, sitting in a wasteland where no water had flowed for centuries. My hands shook as I drank the cool water and ate the bread the heavens had baked for me. The sheer mercy of it was too much to comprehend. I laid my heavy head back into the sand and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Only days later, I was broken in the desert, begging for death. The terror of Jezebel's threat had erased all my courage. I was exhausted, profoundly alone, and terrified of losing everything I stood for. But the angel of the Lord returned, touching my shoulder a second time. "Arise and eat," the voice commanded, "because the journey ahead is far too great for you." I had no idea how far God was sending me into the unknown. Sustained solely by that supernatural meal, I walked into the harsh wilderness. For 40 grueling days and 40 silent nights, I marched through jagged mountains and burning sands, without another drop of ordinary food or water. My boots carried me all the way to Mount Horeb, the sacred mountain of God, driven entirely by a strength that was not my own. My feet were bleeding by the time I reached the shadow of Horeb. This was Sinai, the mountain of God, the dirt where Moses once stood before the burning bush, where the sky had split open with thunder and supernatural fire. Now, the sky was just silent. I dragged myself into the cold belly of a cave, wrapping my torn cloak around me like a shroud. I was hundreds of miles from Jezebel's blade, safe from her assassins, yet I had never felt more hunted. I was a prophet losing his own identity, wanting only to disappear into the dark. Then, cutting through the suffocating silence of my mind, the word of the Lord found me. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He already knew, but he needed me to confess the absolute brokenness of my own heart. The words spilled from my lips, heavy with bitterness and sheer defeat. "I have been zealous for the Lord," I cried out. "They have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and slaughtered your prophets. I am the only one left, and they are hunting me down." I braced for a lecture on my lack of faith. Instead, he simply told me to stand outside. I stepped onto the ledge. Suddenly, a deafening, supernatural wind ripped across the peaks, screaming with such brutal force that solid stone shattered into dust. I dropped to my knees, shielding my face as the mountain tore apart like dry leaves. It was terrifying, unstoppable divine power ravaging the world. Yet, as I trembled in the settling dust, I realized the presence of the Lord was not in that violent wind. Before I could catch my breath, the ground beneath me began to violently heave. A massive earthquake shook the world's foundations, throwing me against the rocks. Fissures split the mountain, and boulders tumbled into the valleys. It was a terrifying display of absolute power. But as the shaking faded, my crushing isolation returned. He was not in the earthquake. Suddenly, blistering heat flushed my skin. A supernatural fire erupted before me, blazing with the fierce intensity I had just seen when I called down judgment at Carmel. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for his thundering voice. But he was not in the roaring inferno. The flames vanished as quickly as they came, leaving a thick, heavy stillness in the high-altitude air. And then came something completely unexpected. Out of the dead silence came a sound so fragile it nearly broke my aching heart. A still, small voice. A gentle, low whisper floating through the air. After the crushing wind, the violent earthquake, and the blinding fire, God chose to speak to my terrified soul in the most tender way imaginable. I pulled my mantle over my face and stepped out, tears cutting paths through the dirt on my cheeks. In that quiet whisper, my deep loneliness finally lifted. He gave me a new purpose. I was to return through the wilderness of Damascus. He commanded me to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and a young man named Elisha as the prophet to take my place. I was not a discarded failure. He was weaving my fleeting life into a massive, eternal divine plan. These men were not random choices. Hazael would be God's heavy hand of judgment against Israel's rebellion. Jehu would be the blade that finally wiped out the wicked house of Ahab, avenging the innocent blood Jezebel had spilled. And Elisha would carry my mantle, finishing the work I started. The crushing pressure of having to save the nation all by myself simply vanished. Then the Lord spoke the words that healed my weary soul. Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. 7,000. I closed my eyes, letting the truth wash over my battered spirit. I had been so blinded by my own fear, so certain I was the only righteous believer left alive on earth. All this time, I was never truly alone. That revelation finally shattered my isolation. I left the mountain completely restored, heading to the Jordan Valley. I found Elisha working the fields of Abel-Meholah, covered in sweat, driving 12 yoke of oxen through the dark soil. He was a wealthy farmer's son, anchored in a safe life. I watched him, knowing the profound sacrifice God was demanding. Without a word, I walked across the plowed dirt, pulled the heavy prophetic mantle from my shoulders, and cast it over his back. It was no simple greeting. It was a divine claim on his soul. Elisha stopped dead in his tracks. He let go of the wood. I saw the realization hit him. He knew exactly what the weight of that rough cloak meant. He understood the peaceful, prosperous life he was being called to abandon forever. When I finally threw my mantle over Elisha, I watched him wrestle with the fears we all face. I told him to go back. I needed him to count the cost, completely free of pressure. "What have I done to you?" I asked. He had to choose this lonely path for himself. What he did next proved his old identity was truly dead. Elisha took the very oxen that represented his wealth and slaughtered them in the field. He smashed his wooden plows, using the splinters as firewood to boil the meat, feeding everyone around him. It was a visceral, irreversible burning of his past. He walked away from a comfortable life to become my servant in the unforgiving wilderness. Soon after he joined my journey, a sickening injustice unfolded in the palace that would seal King Ahab's doom forever. "Step into the dust of Samaria with me. You and I are going to live this nightmare together." I stand in the shadow of Ahab's massive palace, clutching my own family's deed, trembling. The whole tragedy starts so quietly. Our king just wants a vegetable garden. He looks at Naboth's vineyard right next door and decides he has to have it. Ahab doesn't draw a sword, not at first. He offers silver or even a better plot of land somewhere else. To any foreign trader, it sounds completely fair. But Naboth and I know the terror beneath the offer. The king is asking us to sell our souls. God gave our families this land forever. To sell it means erasing who we are, wiping away our sacred heritage. Naboth looks the king in the eye and says no, protecting our faith, even as my own heart pounds with pure dread. Naboth isn't trying to be a rebel. He is just desperately holding onto the last shred of our identity, obeying the Lord's commands while the rest of the nation bows to false idols. I watch from the palace courtyard as King Ahab storms past me. The most powerful man in Israel throws himself onto his bed, turns his face to the cold stone wall, and refuses to eat. He pouts like a spoiled, sullen child denied a toy. But my fleeting amusement turns to ice in my veins when Queen Jezebel walks the halls. Her cold eyes miss nothing. She sees her husband's pathetic weakness, and a cruel smile touches her lips. I press myself against the pillar, terrified. She has already slaughtered so many of our prophets. Now she looks at the king and promises to get the vineyard her own way. The darkness closing in around us feels absolute. You might wonder how a nation loses its soul. Stick with me, we're going to walk through this together. Queen Jezebel wanted Naboth's vineyard, and her plan was terrifyingly simple. She forged King Ahab's seal on letters, ordering our corrupt city elders to host a fast. They seated Naboth with honor, only to hire 2 scoundrels to falsely testify that he blasphemed God and the king. They stoned an innocent man to death in the dirt. When Jezebel triumphantly told Ahab it was over, he didn't ask a single question. He simply rushed down to claim his blood-soaked prize. But the Lord saw this entire conspiracy of theft and murder. My master, Elijah, was suddenly given a message of divine judgment that would shake the royal family to its very foundations. The command came to my master clear as thunder. Go meet King Ahab in the vineyard. He murdered a man to steal. Elijah was ordered to deliver a horrifying curse. In the exact place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, the dogs will lick up yours. I felt sick to my stomach, imagining that confrontation. We fully expected Ahab to fly into a violent rage or demand my master's head for treason, like he had done so many times before during his long rebellion against God. But what happened next shocked everyone. When Ahab heard that terrible prophecy, the man who had mercilessly hunted us just shattered. He literally ripped his royal robes off his back. He dressed himself in rough sackcloth, refused all food, and wandered his palace in deep, visible mourning. I Desperado Y wanted to believe it was just a cheap political trick to save his reputation. But the grief radiating from him was entirely real. Ahab, the king who had dragged all of Israel into the filth of idol worship, was absolutely destroyed by the weight of his own sin. He dressed like a mourner at a funeral, visibly broken over the divine judgment coming to his house. My heart was completely torn. How could God forgive him? But the Lord spoke to my master again, showing a kind of mercy that still makes my head spin. God said, "Do you see how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because of this, I will not bring this ruin during his lifetime." The Lord was genuinely moved by his weeping, deciding to delay the complete judgment until the days of his son. Now, you and I both know that God's justice never fails. That royal house was still marked for total destruction. The delay was simply mercy, sparing Ahab from watching his own children pay for his crimes. It proved that even the most corrupt soul can find grace if they truly repent. But while the palace waited for doom, something terrifying was shifting in my own life. The time had come for an event that hadn't happened since the world began. God was preparing to pull my master directly into heaven, completely bypassing physical death. Elijah felt his earthly ministry ending, though neither of us knew exactly how it would happen. What started as an ordinary journey between a master and his servant was about to become the most miraculous, heart-wrenching departure in history. We walked the dusty road from Gilgal, the silence between us absolutely crushing. This wasn't a casual trip. It was a divinely orchestrated farewell tour through the most sacred places in our history. Suddenly, Elijah stopped and looked at me with tired eyes. "Stay here, please," he told me. "The Lord has sent me to Bethel." It was a test of my loyalty, a loving attempt to protect me from the trauma of watching him go. He was offering me a chance to stay in the safety of the familiar. My heart pounded, but I looked right back at him and swore, "As the Lord lives, I will not leave you." I absolutely refused to be separated from my mentor. But when we finally reached the city of Bethel, the reality of my impending loneliness hit me even harder. The other prophets already knew. The prophets in Bethel came creeping out, pulling me aside. "Do you know the Lord is taking your master today?" They whispered. I snapped at them. "Yes, I know, keep silent." I was suffocating under the pressure, unable to dwell on losing the only man who felt like a father to me. We kept moving toward the Jordan River, the exact waters God had parted for Joshua centuries ago. It felt like the whole world was watching my life fall apart. 50 trained prophets followed us, standing far off in the distance, just waiting to witness history. They stayed safe on the edges, completely blind to the terrifying loneliness tearing me apart from the inside. When we finally stood on the muddy banks of the Jordan, my master took a breath and prepared for one final, historic miracle. Let's leave the toxic air of the palace and stand on the hillside, where I find myself huddled with 50 other weary sons of the prophets. We are so exhausted, so lonely in our faith, desperate for a sign. Down below, Elijah takes his heavy mantle, rolls it up in his weathered hands, and strikes the muddy waters of the Jordan. I gasp as the river violently tears open, splitting left and right, leaving a dry, dusty path right through the riverbed. My ancestors walked through the Red Sea with Moses and crossed this very river with Joshua, but seeing it with my own eyes, it shakes me to my core. The water stands like walls of glass. They walk across safely. In a kingdom that demands we worship false gods, this massive miracle is a blinding flash of hope. The Almighty God of our fathers is still here. His power hasn't abandoned us. I watch from the distant ridge, straining to see them on the far bank. They are completely alone now. I know what it means to feel that isolation, the crushing weight of standing against an entire corrupted nation. Elijah turns to his loyal servant, his voice carrying across the quiet valley, asking what he can do before he is taken away forever. Elisha doesn't ask for wealth or an army to overthrow Jezebel. He asks for the double portion of Elijah's spirit. It is the plea of a firstborn son begging for his father's true inheritance. He is asking to carry the unbearable weight of being God's voice in a lost world. My own chest tightens at the sheer courage of it. Elijah shakes his head, knowing he cannot give what only heaven controls. He sets the impossible condition. Elisha must keep his eyes open and witness the departure. Stick with me here, because what happens next defies everything you and I know about reality. I am gripping the rough bark of a tree, my eyes burning because I refuse to blink. Without a single warning, the sky rips wide open, a chariot forged entirely out of blinding. Roaring divine fire plunges down from the heavens. Pulled by phantom horses of pure flame, the heat hits my face even from this distance. It doesn't scorch the grass. This is the holy fire of God, the exact same terrifying presence I have longed to see return to our broken land. The flaming horses violently drive a wedge between the two men. The wind begins to scream, spinning into a massive whirlwind that swallows Elijah whole. He is pulled straight upward into the raging storm. My knees buckle under me, and I weep from the sheer, overwhelming majesty of it. I am left staring at an empty sky, struggling to comprehend what just happened. A living, breathing man was pulled directly into the holy presence of God without ever tasting death. In the midst of all our fear, in a world ruled by tyrants who want to erase our very existence, this proves our faith is not in vain. If walking through this ancient dust with me has stirred your own soul, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You and I need to share these incredible stories of God's power with a world that feels just as dark today. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment of this journey gave you the most hope. Remember, the exact same God who ripped the river open and sent down chariots of fire is still moving in your life right now. Keep your faith, hold on to your identity, and I'll see you in the next adventure.